their iSchool. That's where I earned my PhD. Before that, I did my Master's of Library and Information Science at Dominican University down in the burbs of Chicago. And then before that, earned my Bachelor's of Arts in English Literature and Secondary Education from Elmhurst College, again in the burbs of Chicago. I have experience working in an academic library. I have experience working in a public library. I do not have much experience in the sum from both of those places. I worked in the academic library for about 2.5 years, worked in the public library for half a year, and then went on for my PhD afterwards. However, during that good professional time and during my undergraduate experience and continuing on through my master's and then my PhD, I gained a lot of experience using WordPress in a lot of different ways. I have had my own website since about 2002, 2003. This is how all this fun started. Then I went on to do some website design work for Elmhurst College when I was working in their academic library, and then did some administration for them on their site. When I moved on to my master's degree and gained even more experience working with WordPress, I started to build bespoke learning management systems using WordPress, which was a lot of fun and pushed my skill set even further. And also showed me just how far we can take what is a fairly, I would say, basic content management system and extend it for specific purposes. And this learning management system had a lot of, I would say, social media affordances, individual learner profiles, groups, discussion forums, an activity feed like you would see in Twitter where you could, post updates and @ replies. There was wiki features built into it. It was a lot of fun. And that was for a massive open online course that I developed, or co-developed, I should say, with Michael Stevens, who is a professor at San Jose State University. Today, I primarily use WordPress again for my own professional website, and I do it to help other professional organizations that I'm involved with get a web presence. Also in those years, I did a bunch of consulting work on WordPress, some for libraries, some not, some for just companies or small nonprofits. And it's been a lot of fun working with WordPress. I'm going to show off 2 books here, though I'm going to tell you not to buy them, but I will tell you why that is. So the first is this library technology report that I wrote with my co-author, Polly Farrington, and this was published in 2011. Then we expanded on that and wrote this book called Learning from Libraries That Use WordPress. And that was published in, I want to say 2013. Yep, I'm right. 2013. I'm going to say you don't necessarily need to purchase these books because there's a lot that's changed between 2011 and now 2022. But the Learning from Libraries That Use WordPress book has some really interesting case studies in there that you may want to reference. But I have a lot of experience with WordPress, and I think that's one of the reasons that Shauna invited me today, and I'm happy to be with you. A couple of things that I want to talk about in terms of the webinar format, not just for today, but for the next 2 iterations of this webinar. So first off, in terms of topics, today we're going to be doing like a getting started talk. So I'm going to try to give you the hard sell on WordPress. I'm also going to be pretty transparent about its weaknesses along with its strengths. And then I'm going to walk you through what it looks like to install the system. So that's the only technical bit that we're going to get into today. I really want you to understand kind of the category of technology of WordPress, get an understanding of where it came from. And we'll get into more details with that. So not a lot of techie stuff today. The next 2 iterations, we'll get into more tutorials, right? So we'll talk about how to create content in WordPress and organize that content. So that'll be the second webinar next week. And then the third webinar, we're going to talk about extending WordPress a little bit more by looking at things called plugins and themes. So this allows you to change the look and feel of your WordPress site. That's what a theme does. And then add more affordances or more tools or features into your WordPress website using plugins. So we'll do more tech work then. But just to be clear, nobody has to have any experience with any technology in order to use WordPress. I believe that wholeheartedly. That's one of the reasons that I'm an advocate for using WordPress and libraries. It's just not necessary to be a programmer or to understand how to write HTML or do CSS or play with PHP or build a database. Like, none of that stuff is necessary. I'll talk about some of it, but it's not necessary in order to be successful with WordPress, in my humble opinion. With regard to the actual structure of the webinar, I'm going to be doing something a little bit differently, and I hope you're okay with it. It's how we're going to do it. But I think it has some advantages. So what I've done is I've already pre-recorded the webinar talk that I'm going to give, right? And so I'm going to share my screen. We're going to watch this video together. But the advantage is that whenever you have any questions, what I want you to do is feel free and encouraged, regardless of what the question is, put it in the chat, and I will be on that chat right away answering questions. And also, if we need to pause the webinar and have a conversation together, we can do that. Or if we need to show something off in WordPress, we can do that too. So that's kind of how the presentation aspect of this webinar is going to go. And then on the tail end, once the video ends, I'd like us to come together and have a discussion about what we learned in the webinar. And then if there's anything in specific that you want to see in WordPress, I'm happy to bring up my personal website that has some interesting developments in it and walk you through that. And if you're interested in what that website is, I'll put it in the chat right now for you, so you can poke around and see what I'm doing on it. Yeah, so that's how this is going to go. Hope everybody is good with that. I'm an informal guy when it comes to these types of presentations. I was telling Shauna that earlier. There's no reason to be formal about these things. I hope you feel comfortable asking me questions, speaking out, turning on your webcam if you want, or you don't want, that's fine too. But please do feel free to ask me any questions you have. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and let's get this thing started. We have 4 topics for this particular webinar. First, I want to give you a bit of a lecture on what WordPress is, what the company is, what it does in terms of the different stakeholders or different groups that it serves, and talk a little bit about WordPress as a content management system. Then we're going to talk about WordPress and its fit in libraries, which of course is very important to you and very relevant. Then we're going to do a little bit of a tutorial on what it looks like to install WordPress the first time. Now, this is going to be a technical run through, and as we'll talk about, it may be a situation that doesn't apply to you if you have, let's say, a host like DreamHost where you can just click, give me WordPress and it installs it for you and you don't have to do any of the work. But it's important to know what a WordPress install looks like. And then I'm going to take the covers off and I'm going to show you kind of the technical underpinnings of WordPress. These technical underpinnings are something that you may never have to touch, but it's good to know how the system works. Let's begin with a brief overview of WordPress, and there are 3 different areas I want to talk about. First, what is a CMS, or content management system, and why is it that we actually care? The second one being, what is WordPress in terms of its growth? So looking at it from, kind of its conception, where it was born, how it was born, and what its evolution has been to date, and what's the perception of WordPress to date. And then the last thing is talking about different flavors of WordPress, because there are 2 very specific flavors or versions. I like to call them flavors, but versions of WordPress. So what is a content management system and why is it that we actually care? So by now you know that a CMS is a content management system. And what content management systems do is they allow us as users of content management systems to easily publish, edit, modify, and delete content from a central location. And when we're talking about content, we're not just talking about text. We're not just talking about video. We're not just talking about audio. We're not just talking about, photos that are embedded into the text. We're talking about the combination, the potential combination of all of these things in a single object. And that we have the ability
by going into this central web-based location to manipulate the content, to manage it quite easily. And also what content management systems do is that they provide us the ability to very carefully organize this content. Different content management systems do it in unique ways. In WordPress, we're going to be talking primarily about two different types of taxonomy styles. The categories and the tags. That's the way that we can provide some organizational strategy to our content. And then also other two structural ways by looking at them as different types or pieces of content. So we have pages and then we have posts. And I'll get into that much more specifically later on. But it's just an example of how content management systems allow us to organize our content. Moreover, what CMSs do is they focus our energy on content creation instead of fixating on the presentation of the content. And so the difference is that we're not writing code. We're not doing programming each time that we want to publish content to the web. Today, this is common. This is the typical way of doing things, is that we upload a photo and we press publish and then it's on the web. But that has not always been the case. If you've followed the history of the internet and the web as it has evolved, it has gone from being this very tedious way of writing HTML to present content to what it is today, which is the standard with CMSs in terms of just focusing in on, writing that blog post or putting together that web page and pressing publish. And CMSs allow us to do that very easily. Additionally, what CMSs allow for is that they allow for multiple users and different levels of user controls to manage the content. So if I'm at a library and I am the department head, maybe I have a different set of user privileges than the librarians who maybe write blog posts, but I'm the one who actually edits and publishes them. So the content management system can manipulate how a user interacts with it by saying, well, you can do A, B, and C, but you can't do D, E, and F. And that's helpful because it really supports this next point, and that it allows us to create a content workflow in much the same way that maybe a traditional publication would, like a newspaper. The journalist goes out into the field, they do some research, they talk to some people, they compile a story together, they submit that to their editor, the editor looks it over and says, well, we've got A, B, and C that we need to work on before we can actually put it into print. And then the editor says, okay, well, it's time, it's ready, it looks good, let's put it into print. So you have different levels there of people who can really take care of the workflow of a piece of content from thought to actual construction and to publication. And finally, CMSs are extremely popular. They're highly supported and are accessible for the most part with those with low and high technology skills alike. This isn't a technology that's only available to the people at Palo Alto. This is really a pretty democratic piece of web technology because it allows a number of different people with a number of different skills to participate in the creation and the management of content. And I say that they're popular and they're highly supported, and of course that depends on the specific content management system that we're talking about. Primarily, I'm focused in on WordPress, and I will talk about this a little bit later. WordPress is extremely popular and it is highly supported. But maybe if we talk about something like Concrete 5, which is another content management system, we could say, well, that popularity, it's not as high in comparison with Drupal or WordPress. And maybe it's not as highly supported, but it still has accessibility. Or maybe something is very popular and highly supported, but maybe is not as accessible by those with low skills. So of course those things move in flux, but content management systems, I guess I should say, are the norm today, more than the folks who are working in Dreamweaver and writing code and publishing it in that way, which I have experienced in my history, and I'm so happy that we're using content management systems these days instead of focusing in on closing our P tags and doing things with unordered lists. We don't really have to focus in on those things with CMSs. So let's take a minute here to talk about a brief history of WordPress. I think it's informative. I think it helps you understand a little bit about the evolution of the system. And while it might not help you actually write a piece of content, it gives you a little bit of context and gives you, I think, a sound footing. If you need to speak to your peers about WordPress and you have an understanding a little bit about its history, then it's easier, I think, for you to go into a conversation and say, look, I think WordPress is a good content management system for us to consider because it's been around since 2003. It's highly supported. It has a large user community, all of this stuff. Anyways, having this history is really, I think, a part of the necessary arsenal you need to build up if you're wanting to use WordPress in your setting. So with that kind of aside, let's get into the specific points here. So WordPress was born in 2003. So 12 years old at this point. I guess in technology terms, that's a pretty old piece of technology. And it started from a fork or a split of another piece of technology, here the B2 Cafe log code. And it started as open source, and it has remained open source ever since. And so what that means is that all of the code available is able to be manipulated, able to be recoded, able to be customized, able to be contributed to. If you wanted to go to, say, WordPress.org and promote a certain feature or build a certain feature, you could do that, and then through the system, the open source system, and the core coders, they could say, well, that's a really good idea. I like your piece of code. I'm going to integrate it into the core of WordPress. Or if you don't want to have it integrated into the core of WordPress, you could say, well, I'm just going to build it myself and hook it up into my own installation of WordPress. So that's really the beauty of open source, is that it allows the large community of programmers to have a say in the development of the system. And I think that's only helped it to be as successful as it is and as it has been. WordPress, I'm sure if you have any understanding of WordPress, you understand it in this way, that it's a blogging system. And that is true to an extent. It began with a focus on blogging, on doing web blogging, so that journaling style of writing content and publishing content. That's how it started. And over time, it has significantly developed, not in a way that has cut that kind of arm off of its core. It's not a major focus anymore necessarily of the system. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the bottom here. WordPress has undergone constant development since 2003, constant updates, constant kind of new features are being added to it. If not yearly, bi-yearly, because it has a really strong and committed community. The core developers continue to work on it, continue to refine it, continue to make it better, both in terms of the underlying technology, but also the aesthetics of the system. They work on the user experience of it as well, and that's one of its major advantages, I have to say, in comparison with other content management systems, is that because so much time has been put into the user experience of WordPress, it is much more usable, and I think that's one of the reasons it has a higher adoption rate than some of the competitors. But more about this committed community, because I think that's a very significant point. So since WordPress has become so successful over the years, it has gained a lot of attention, it's gained a lot of interest from people with a variety of different skill sets. I think I'm a really good example of that. I started using WordPress in 2006, I believe, 2006, 2007, when I started to build my very first course site for my student teaching experience. I wanted my students to blog, so I wanted to build a WordPress-based course experience for them. So I started into the community as a user, but as I got more involved with it, I started, being a lot more active in the forums at WordPress.org. I started trying to tweak the code here and there in terms of the themes that I was using. Those themes it's the visual element of WordPress. Eventually, I started even doing some custom programming for some very specific plugins for my core sites, which you are actually using, or at least viewing, if not creating content for, you're viewing as a part of this course experience. And so I think I have continued to stay involved in the community like many other people have, because there's been a lot of feedback when I've had questions. There's been a lot of interested people who want to see what you're doing with WordPress, especially in new and unique ways. And it's, for the most part, it's a very family-friendly type of community. And unfortunately, we can't say that for a lot of the spaces on the internet, but we can say that for WordPress. So I think that's why, those are just a couple of reasons why the community is very committed to each other and continues to grow. So about this blogging shadow that it has over it, I think that WordPress has very much shed this blogging shadow. It's now a full-blown content management system. It now has many of the features that we talked about in the previous slide, and it has developed in such a way that it allows for a lot of flexibility in the past, where it has stuck to its blogging roots, is stuck to saying, well, we're all about writing posts and blogging and doing this journaling style content publication. And now it's saying, well, we recognize that the user community needs to go beyond that to be much more flexible in terms of its content creation and its organization. And so we're going to build into the core of WordPress some features to accommodate for those needs. And you'll even see this if you kind of peruse through the WordPress.org website. You'll see a change in the rhetoric and what they say about WordPress. And as you look through some of the installation settings that you'll go through, I think it has a greater focus on using the word site instead of blog. And that's them saying, we recognize that we're going away from this blogging only kind of system to be much more of a full-blown CMS, while still retaining the strong blogging features that it does have. And today, WordPress is used by millions. It's absolutely millions of individuals, and including into that different organizations and institutions, including Fortune 500 companies, university websites. I think the University of Ontario perhaps uses it, one of the Canadian websites. And then, of course, there are many within the United States as well. And also news organizations, I believe the New York Times and the Washington Post use it for certain features or for certain subsites of their entire website setting. And then, of course, candidates for office tend to use it as well. I think Rand Paul uses it. And then some, as you'll see, I think if you go to I think it's vip.wordpress.com, you can see case studies of different types of large organizations that use it. So the flavors of WordPress. There are two very different flavors of WordPress, and I can't stress this enough because I think people get confused about it. So there's WordPress.com, notice the bold there, and WordPress.org. The .com version allows for anyone to create a blog. It's very much like Tumblr, where you create a username and a password, and then you have a blog. The .com version, again, stresses the blogging part of WordPress. And it's free. And the hosting is free, meaning that you don't have to use somebody like DreamHost or DreamGator or whatever, GoDaddy, any of the hosts to make your website live and accessible by the world. If you want to add in additional features, then you can upgrade your account and you can pay for new stuff. You never have to pay for the hosting. You never have to pay for the maintenance. You never have to do the maintenance yourself. You simply write the content and you go with it. It's very user-friendly, but it's also very limited, as I'll talk about a little bit more. Now, the .org version, and that's the one that we'll be using. I have to write this down if you're taking notes. We are using the .org version. And the .org version says, here's a package of code. Go and play with it. Go install it on your own server. Go host it with DreamHost is where we'll be using. That's the service I use. And do with it what you will. But understand that you are required to do the maintenance. Well, I guess you're not required. You could just install it and let it die a slow death and get hacked and all of that stuff. But you are responsible for clicking the update button, for making sure that it works properly. And all of that responsibility is on your shoulders. But you can do with the code what you want. You can install any theme. Again, that's the aesthetic layer of WordPress. You can install any theme you want. You can install any plugin you want, and plugins add in new features into WordPress. You can install any plugin you want. You can do with it what you will. So ultimately, .org gives you the most freedom, but it also gives you the most responsibility at the same time. So that's one of the things we have to learn as we begin our journey in WordPress, is that since we're using .org, we can do with it what we want. We can think freely about how we want to customize this to our needs, or based on the whims we have, or if we want to explore certain themes or certain plugins. But things can break then. There's nobody looking over our shoulder and saying, well, if you install that plugin, you might get like this white page on your WordPress site where you can't do anything unless you know how to back your way out of it. So are you ready for that? So that's something that you have to take into consideration when going the .org route. And I don't mean to say all of this to scare you and say, oh, don't use .org, only use .com. Because actually, I don't think that's the way to go, especially for a library context where you will have to do some customization, or you're going to have specific community needs, or you're going to want to present content in a way that WordPress.com won't allow you to. So going with .org and shouldering some of the responsibilities is, I think, ultimately worth it in the end when you have some of the freedoms that you do. All right, so let's talk about WordPress for libraries specifically, and why it's a good fit. What are some of the advantages, and what are some of its disadvantages? So why is it a good fit? So I have library experience in a couple of different libraries, an academic library and a public library, and I have years of experience talking to people who have done internships in libraries and worked in libraries, and people I've spoken with at library conferences about WordPress and content management systems. And I think one of the trends that I get from these conversations and from my own experience is I think it's fair to say that not all libraries have the technical skills or necessarily the infrastructure to support a content management system. And we could talk about that and assign blame or assign reasons for a number of different purposes, or a number of different reasons. But the point being is that our technical skill set for this sort of thing is not necessarily at the highest level. But that's why WordPress is really a good fit, because it doesn't necessarily take a web services librarian to get it up and going. It doesn't take somebody with a CS degree. Excuse me. And it doesn't necessarily take a custom built infrastructure in order to run it. It requires very little of both of those things. And WordPress, I think, really helps us get off the ground with doing content management and content publishing, whereas other content management systems are sometimes a little more difficult to use at the get-go. For a number of years there, Drupal was extremely hard just to get up and running and working properly and easily enough, unless you had some real experience with it, or you were willing to really push through a lot of the initial hurdles. I think, in all fairness to Drupal, I think it's gotten a lot better over the last couple of years. So, but on the second point, for those libraries that do have the advanced skills, WordPress is really malleable enough to bend to their wants and their needs. So if you're at a public library or an academic library or whatever library that has, somebody with the technical chops and somebody who's built up the technical infrastructure in terms of having the servers and the hosts and, has that all built up and ready to go, and they want to do some really heavy duty customization to it, more power to them. You can do that with WordPress. Just because it doesn't require a whole lot of technical skills to get into it doesn't mean that it limits those with the technical skills. And out of the box, it's just simply hard to beat. It just works. You just install it and you run it, and it doesn't take a whole lot to get a website up and going that's running WordPress, as you'll find out here shortly. And it doesn't need a lot of maintenance. It doesn't need constant checking for security. And if it does need a security fix, WordPress, the folks at WordPress.org who do the core development are on top of that. They are on top of that, and they will let you know via your own WordPress site that, hey, you really need to update this to version 4.1.1 or something like that. And it's low cost. Obviously, the files themselves from WordPress are free. So you just have to download those and get those into your host, into your server, and get them up and running. So the cost there for WordPress.org, the version we're using, is in paying for your host and paying for that domain name to get it up and running. So what are its advantages? Just generally, what are its advantages? And I think there's actually a lot of overlap with what I said about libraries. So, first, it's really easy to get started with little technical knowledge. It's web-based administration, so you don't need a special application to manage it. You don't have to download, say, for instance, Dreamweaver to manage it. You just log in via the web. You can do it. So in that case, you can do it via your computer at work. You can do it at your computer at home. You can do it via your iPad or even through your iPhone. There are special, you can download free applications via iPad or for the iPad or for the iPhone to do that. Or you could just log in via your browser on your iPad or any device really that connects to the internet. We already talked about the users in their roles, so the distributed workflow is important. The remote updating is an especially great feature. And what I mean by that is that you don't have to upload new files or recompile code or change code for the core of WordPress to be updated. Honestly, you just click a button and it updates. It's that simple. And of course, there's the huge supportive user community, the availability of themes and plugins that are free or that you can purchase on the market. I mean, some of the best plugins that I've seen that really transform WordPress are sometimes no more than $25. So they're accessible if they're not free. And you can count on its stability. Honestly, I think WordPress at this point is it's too big to fail, and there are too many eyes looking at it and relying on it. That for it to have a catastrophic failure across, all installations of WordPress, it just wouldn't happen unless there's some significant bug or hack that's going on. So what are its disadvantages? There are a couple here, and as you get your hands on WordPress, I'm sure you'll identify ones that you're like, well, I don't like it the way it does this, or the way it does that, or in my comparison with using Omeka or Content DM, it doesn't do certain things well. That's fine. All CMSs have their inherent advantages and their inherent disadvantages, and sometimes those disadvantages depend primarily on what your perspective is and what your experience is. But here are some that I believe to be true, just kind of based on my own experience and my own perspective. So you have to know its internal structure to truly bend it to your will, to truly do the customization. You got to be able to dig into the HTML and the PHP to make it look the way you want, to make it act the way you want. In that sense, it's not what you see is what you get. It's not WYSIWYG. So in order to modify it for very specific situations, so if you want to have like some libguides functionality or do some digital archives work with it, it's going to take some really strong knowledge about the core of WordPress and about how plugins work and about how themes work and how all three of those kind of work together. And in that case, depending on your time, depending on your skill set, depending on your money, I mean, maybe you can pay for a consultant to do all this work for you. Other CMSs may be a better fit. Like Omeka, out of the box, is going to be a much better tool for doing digital archival work than WordPress will be. And unlike Drupal, it does take some effort to create custom content structures. So Drupal makes it really simple to go beyond kind of this post-page content structure and say, well, I need to create a bookmarks content type, or I want to create a book review content type to structure content in a very specific way. And the last one I just don't think is arguable. Its native search feature is just awful. It's just awful. It does a fine job if you're using posts and pages. If you're writing a blog post or you have just a traditional page of content, it can search through that. If you do anything more than that, you break the search feature. And the search feature works in a way that it's just a keyword search, and that's it. So it's not, you can't do any kind of filtering unless you build in some more functionality. So I just find it extremely limited, but maybe that's the librarian in me saying, well, we can do things a heck of a lot better than this. But that's the disadvantage I see with it.
To run this install, we're going to work with some credentials that I've been using in a previous class that I've taught. These credentials have passwords and database names and host names and everything in this nice, neat table. So we're going to be copying and pasting some things into the WordPress install. So I'm going to hop over to this tab where I've already sent my browser to my website, which is at the w15.thecorkboard.org URL. I'm choosing English as my language. It says, hey, you need to gather all this information because we're going to go through these steps to install your site. Okay, I have all that information because all of that information exists in that table. So let's match that up just real quick. Database name. Where's my database name? Oh, there it is. That's my database name. All right, what about my database username? Oh, there it is. w15_db. Database password. There you go, all that good stuff. And then the final thing is the database host, which is this. And then it says your table prefix. This is something we can change, but we don't have to. I'll talk about that in a second. So let's go. First, our database name. All right, I'm going to go over to my table here. Let's see if I can copy this. There we go. Put that in. And now it wants my username, which is this. Copy that. Bring that over. Now it wants my password. Okay, copy that. Put that in. Wants my database host, so it knows where to look for my database. That's that. And then it says my table prefix. So you can make your table prefix anything you want as long as there's not a space in between the characters. I'm going to suggest to you just to put your identifier or your number in front of after the WP. So this would be W15_. So what that means is that when we look at the database, every single table that exists in that database will be prefixed with WP15_. Right? And so if we were to install multiple WordPress instances within a single table, we would need to prefix those installations differently so that the system knows from which installation or set of database tables it needs to pull information out of. You don't really need to understand that to learn how to do WordPress, to learn how to maximize WordPress. I'm just giving you a little bit of extra knowledge there. So let's click submit. See what happens. All right, it did a check. It said, hey, we can communicate with your database. Looks like we're good to go. Run that installation. I want some information. I'm going to call this my sweet website. Kyle. For my username, I will accept their strong password, but I could also make it awful, like my password. It'll tell you that it's an awful password if it's weak. I'm going to confirm the use of the weak password because they just want me to do that. And then I will put in my email address. You can try to discourage search engines from indexing your site. Install WordPress. Might take a second for the install to run because it's building all of the things in the database. And it looks like we're good. We can log in. So, my password, login. And there we are. Our installation is complete. Now what I want to do is show you kind of how the sausage is made, how WordPress gets to be installed in terms of its technical parts, right? Like how everything works together. I think it's good for you to know these things, or at least be able to see these things, even if you don't fully understand conceptually how they're working together. So just follow along at home so you get an idea of what's actually going on, how the cogs all work together. So what I've done, just so you know, is I have deleted all of the content out of the database. I have deleted all of the WordPress files off of the server. And so now we are at my site, and it is giving me this message from my my website host, DreamHost, that says, oh, you're almost there. Basically what it means, this is their default image, but basically what it means is there is nothing on the server, right? It is now up to you to put things on the server. There are no WordPress files here. Similarly, we go to the database. It says that there are no tables found in the database, meaning that WordPress hasn't been installed. So what we need to do is go through the process of installing WordPress. And to do that, we need to work with our friend CyberDuck and set up our first connection. So I'm going to set up a connection here. And it has all of my information here because I've been kind of working in this space already, called WP15. And you can see that it has all of the information that is also right here. So we have the site URL, the SFTP server, all of that. So this will line up with what you see here. That's great. So once I have that put in, I'm going to start my connection. It's going to log me in, which is wonderful. And you can see that there is nothing on the server besides some favicons or fab icons, or pronounce that however you will. Basically, that's the little icon that you see in the browser URL window. Anyways, we need to get WordPress on this server. So to make things quick, I have already downloaded WordPress, but I'm going to show you where it's at just for the fun of it. So you go to wordpress.org, you say, hey, give me WordPress, right? And then you do the download and install it yourselves version, and then it gives you the button to download the WordPress package. I've done that already. So again, let's go back to CyberDuck here, and then let's hop over to Finder, which is Mac for you Windows peeps. I'm going to, I can't believe I just said peeps. Let's roll with it. Let's select everything in WordPress, and then let's drag. Nope, come on. Nope, come on. There we go. Let's drag and then drop it into CyberDuck. Now it's going to take just a few minutes before it will finally be completely uploaded, so you just got to hang in there with me while I riff. There are a couple of things that I do want to talk about while this uploads. First, when you see these files in here, I'm going to point out that there's basically one area that you do work in on the server when it comes to messing with server files, and that's going to be called the WP content folder. And we'll go into this a little bit more once we start to talk about installing plugins and installing themes. But everything else, every other file that you're about to see in this space is it's a WordPress core file, meaning that WordPress needs that file in order for it to run correctly. So it's best that you not mess with those WordPress files. So I'm going to go ahead and just give this a second to finish its install. The notification that all of the files are uploaded, and sure enough, when we look at CyberDuck, we can see them all here. Again, here's that WP content folder, and you can see there are two folders here for plugins and themes. We'll talk about that more later. But now with all of the WordPress files on the server, we can go back to our site, hit refresh, and we'll get the install screen for WordPress. That's great. Let's go ahead and just run this real quick. So just follow along at home. Database name, database username, database password, change this for the fun of it. Oop, almost messed something up there. There we go. And again, what I want to point out right now, press refresh. There is nothing in the database. Once we run this install, you're going to see that database change completely. I'm just going to make this all Kyle. Kyle.com. That does not exist. Confirm. There we go. It is running the installation. Good, it's done. Now when we refresh the database, what you're going to see is a host of tables. And you can see they're all prefixed with our chosen prefix, KJ. Yeah, usually with a WordPress installation, you'll never have to modify any of the database information that exists. Sometimes it's good to know what actually exists in here if you have to do a cleanup after a hack or something like that, which I don't wish that on any of you. But this is where you go to look at what content actually exists within your database. And this is the content really that WordPress pulls out of the database to show to your users of your website. So that's the back end of WordPress. That's how all the cogs work together, so to speak. All right, let's come back together, have a bit of a conversation, do a little Q&A. First off, as my wife and I like to say to each other, especially as we're working on home projects that stress us out, feelings check. How's everybody feeling about WordPress? Feeling stressed? Feeling encouraged? Give me a sense of where you're at. Feel free to put it in the chat or turn on your mic and webcam, whatever you want to do. Yeah, Betty, you've got your mic on. What's going on? It looks like we don't have Betty. Anybody else want to share how they're feeling about WordPress at this point?
Well, I just have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm looking at ours, and it looks like ours is a .com, not the .org. So am I really going to be able to follow along with this webinar? Do I need to upgrade? How much is it to upgrade? Some different things on that.
Yeah, it's good. It's a good question. So with WordPress.com, you can actually run a website there that, well, let me ask you a question, Tara. When you go to your website, does it say like mylibrary.wordpress.com in the URL, or is it a completely different URL?
So it says McCoyPublicLibrary.wordpress.com.
Okay. So you you're running on the WordPress.com free service, which is absolutely fine. The technology that works with WordPress.org and WordPress.com is pretty much the same. If you were to go into the back end of your WordPress.com website and compare it to mine, which is a .org self-install version, you would say, well, there's not a lot different here. So the things that we will definitely learn in the next webinar are applicable to you. The things that we address in the third webinar, which are related to adding in plugins and themes, they still will be applicable to you, but your freedom in terms of what you can choose with regard to plugins and themes will be much more limited, because WordPress.com will only allow you access to certain themes and to certain plugins. Now, with regard to what you said is upgrading, right? WordPress.com will enable you to export your content out of that website and put it into a .org self-install. You can do that. You can absolutely do that. But you will have to pay for the hosting costs, right? Because to put a website together, it requires a server, which means there's a computer somewhere, and that computer is owned by some company, and you have to pay for access to it. So that is the cost involved there. I hope that makes sense.
Yes. So a question on that a little bit further then. If I'm already feeling like this .com basic option is more than what I can know and understand, am I just going to be more overwhelmed by going to a .org and having more options? And there, like you said, you don't have somebody that's kind of watching over your shoulder or preventing you from doing some of these things?
Yeah, that's a great self-check, right? And I think that's it's very good to know about yourself. So I would say in that situation, if you're already feeling a little overwhelmed with WordPress.com, just continue on that journey with .com until you get to a point where you're starting to feel like it's restricting your choices, right? Your limitations. And at that point, once you begin to master the system, then think about moving to a self-install with all of the freedom and flexibility and responsibility that comes with that wonderful power, right? So take it a step at a time. There's no reason that you have to move over to the .org self-install version right away.
Thank you, Kyle. This was a great presentation, and the format really, it worked as well.
Thanks, Sarah.
I just wanted to say, with the free .com and the WordPress.com, you can have more issues with like advertisements and spam popping up.
Yes.
Isn't that true?
With WordPress.com, I believe they already embed advertisements into your site. Those advertisements may look spammy. It's been a while since I've looked at the price structure for WordPress.com, though I would have to think that there's an option for you to upgrade your service at WordPress.com to remove those advertisements. Because remember, those advertisements are all about making money to support the WordPress.com infrastructure. Because they don't really make any money from you creating content or you providing a service to some group of stakeholders. So that's something to be aware of. And so yes, when you go to a self-install of WordPress, you don't have to worry about those advertisements. You could put advertisements on your site if you want, but you're in control of those things. I hope that answers it. I'm going to come back to you, Sarah, or you should speak up if it didn't, but I do want to get to Judy's question in the chat. Judy says, I'm not comfortable with making changes in case I mess it up. Can you work behind the scenes until you like what is created? I'm not exactly sure, Judy, what you're talking about in terms of what you're creating, but I will say if you're focusing on just developing a blog post or developing a page, right, for your site, you can always just keep those in draft mode until you're ready to see, or until you're ready with the final version. And as I'll show you when next week when we talk about content creation, every time you create a blog post or a page, you can always preview it to see what it looks like in real life and make tweaks on it before you're ready to go. And in fact, if you mess something up with a page or a blog post, WordPress creates automatic revisions, right, with everything that you create. So you can always go back in time and choose a different version of the item that you're creating. But that's different than messing something up administratively, like if you remove a file from the FTP server, right, that I was doing in CyberDuck when I installed the files. That's a different issue. But if you don't ever have access to the database and you don't ever have access to the server, you don't have to worry about that stuff. So in that case, you know, the mistakes that you may make in WordPress, you can always find your way back to fix those mistakes. Any other questions? All right, Diane, we use a paid version of .com. We do not have any annoying ads. We like using the .com for our site. Different strokes for different folks, right? Like, it's absolutely fine, I think, if .com is serving your needs as a content creator here and your stakeholder needs in terms of the users of your library website. And I'm an advocate of doing user research for websites specifically. If it's working, don't change it, right? That's absolutely fine.
Kyle, I like that you asked how everyone's feeling so far, and I'm wondering if maybe you could speak to if folks are feeling a little nervous or overwhelmed or unsure, what you might have to say about our second part next week.
Yeah. So I could understand if you're still not feeling like you have a grasp on WordPress, right, after this talk. Because 3/4 of the talk today was like, conceptually, what is WordPress? How does it fit into this like ecosystem of content management systems? And then what I showed you on the tutorial end of things was doing the installs. And I would guess in many of your situations, you probably have one point person who can do that work for you, right? And I tried to emphasize that's not the management work that you will primarily be doing. You'll mostly be content creators and content administrators. And we're going to dig into the details of that next week. And you should be able to walk away from the webinar next week feeling much more comfortable about how to create a post, how to create a page, how to organize your posts, how to do some basic content administration in a way that is very comfortable, or at least it's the first step towards finding comfort with the system. And I just want to tell you anecdotally, even though I have 20 years of using this system, which makes me feel very old, I did not learn it in one sitting. I did not learn it in 1 year. It was after different uses and expanding my interest in the system and the use cases, right, of who I needed to provide content for. That's what expanded my knowledge and I guess arguably my expertise with this technology. So as with anything that you're learning new, you need to be kind to yourself. Give yourself an opportunity to make mistakes. Give yourself an opportunity to learn. And people learn at different trajectories. And yours may be the slow upward trend. For some of you, you might get into it and you might go, wow, I can learn this really quickly. That's great. Good for you. Everybody's a little bit different when it comes to technology, and just give yourself the space to learn.
Well, thank you so much, Kyle. If anyone does have any more questions, please feel free to let us know. But I do want to remind you that, we'll be here again next, what day is it? Wednesday.
Wednesday, yep.
We'll be here next Wednesday at the same time at 9 a.m. Betty says, overwhelmed, but thank you.
Overwhelmed with knowledge, I hope.
Yeah, it totally makes sense, Betty. I've been there before, honestly, with WordPress and other things like HTML years ago, and learning, like finding your edges is not fun. but I believe that there will be one thing that will get you excited about working with WordPress, whether it's a calendar that you really want to have on your website, or you want patrons to know about programming more. I'm sure there's just one thing at least that will maybe help you stay focused, I suppose, or maybe, excited.
Yeah. And there's no homework for these webinars, but
yeah,
want to go off and play, get a WordPress.com site and just mess around a little bit, please do. Come back with questions. Talk to your peers about their needs. Bring their questions to the group. I'm happy to answer anything that you want to bring up. This is, like I said, informal learning experience is what I'm trying to go for here, even though, of course, I've got to give a little bit of a lecture. So I really do appreciate your time. I know we're over, but thank you for spending your morning with me and with Shauna.
Yes, thank you so much. We'll end for today, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you for coming, and thank you so much, Kyle. And we'll see you next week.
All right. Thanks, everybody.